Tour this. You're sitting in the most prestigious boardroom in the city, surrounded by marble walls and crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes. The air smells of expensive leather and power. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by words so venomous, so filled with hate, that they seem to poison the very oxygen in the room. But here's what makes this story different from every other corporate scandal you've heard. The woman who became the target of this racist attack didn't just sit there and take it. She didn't quietly excuse herself or file a complaint later. Instead, she stood up, looked her attacker directly in the eyes, and delivered a response so powerful, so perfectly calculated, that it didn't just silence the room. It changed the entire trajectory of a billion-dollar company. This isn't just another story about workplace discrimination. This is the story of how one moment of courage can topple an empire built on arrogance, and how the most unexpected person can become the catalyst for justice that an entire industry desperately needed. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about power, justice, and the price of standing up for what's right. Because sometimes, the most quiet voice in the room becomes the loudest roar for change. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Millennium Tech Industries, one of Germany's most prestigious software development companies. The glass towers reached toward the gray Berlin sky like fingers grasping for more power, more influence, more control over the digital landscape that was rapidly reshaping the world. Inside the 42nd floor, the executive boardroom buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that only comes before major announcements. Amara Johnson adjusted the collar of her navy blazer and checked her presentation notes one final time. At 28, she was the youngest senior analyst the company had ever hired, and definitely the only black woman to hold such a position in the company's 30-year history. Her credentials were impeccable: a double master's degree from MIT in computer science and business analytics, fluency in 5 languages including German, and a track record of increasing revenue by 40% at her previous company in just 2 years. But none of that seemed to matter to the whispers that followed her through the hallways. She had been recruited personally by the company's chief technology officer, Dr. Elena Richter, a brilliant woman in her 50s who had built her reputation on recognizing talent regardless of where it came from. Dr. Richter had been fighting an uphill battle for diversity in the tech industry for decades, and Amara represented everything she believed the future of technology should look like: brilliant, innovative, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. The boardroom gradually filled with the usual suspects. There was Klaus Weber, the stern-faced chief financial officer who treated every meeting like a military operation. Maria Santos, the head of international relations, whose warm smile masked a razor-sharp intellect that had negotiated some of the biggest deals in the company's history. And then there were the various department heads, project managers, and senior executives who formed the inner circle of Millennium Tech's power structure. But the person everyone was waiting for was Friedrich Mueller, the company's chief executive officer and majority shareholder. Mueller had built Millennium Tech from a small startup in his garage to a multinational corporation worth over 3 billion euros. He was known for his brilliant business acumen, his demanding standards, and his old-school approach to leadership that had somehow managed to keep the company profitable even during the worst economic downturns. He was also known for his temper. Mueller entered the room exactly at 9 o'clock, as he always did. Tall, imposing, with silver hair slicked back and a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, he commanded attention the moment he walked through the door. His pale blue eyes scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who was used to being the most important person wherever he went. The meeting began with the usual reports. Klaus presented the quarterly financial statements, which showed another record-breaking period of growth. Maria discussed the expansion into 3 new markets in Southeast Asia. Various department heads gave updates on their projects, each trying to impress the CEO with their progress and dedication. And then it was Amara's turn. She stood up confidently and moved to the front of the room, connecting her laptop to the massive display screen that dominated the far wall. Her presentation was titled Revolutionary AI Integration: The Future of Customer Experience, and she had spent the last 3 months preparing what she knew would be the most important presentation of her career. The room fell silent as she began to speak. Her voice was clear, confident, and filled with the kind of passion that only comes from someone who truly believes in what they're doing. She explained how artificial intelligence could be integrated into the company's existing customer service platform to create a more personalized, efficient, and profitable system. The data was compelling. Her proposal could increase customer satisfaction by 60% while reducing operational costs by 35%. But what made her presentation truly remarkable was the way she had identified patterns and opportunities that no one else in the company had even considered. She had spent countless hours analyzing customer behavior, market trends, and technological capabilities to create what was essentially a blueprint for the future of the entire industry. As she spoke, she could see the reactions around the room. Dr. Richter was nodding approvingly, clearly proud of her decision to bring Amara onto the team. Klaus Weber was frantically taking notes, already calculating the financial implications of her proposals. Even the usually skeptical department heads were leaning forward, genuinely engaged with what she was saying. But Mueller's face remained unreadable. Amara concluded her presentation with a detailed implementation timeline and budget projection. The numbers were solid, the strategy was sound, and the potential for success was undeniable. She had essentially handed the company a roadmap to dominate their industry for the next decade. The room erupted in questions and discussions. Everyone wanted to know more about the technical specifications, the timeline for implementation, the potential challenges they might face. Amara answered each question with the confidence and expertise that had made her such a valuable addition to the team. For a moment, it seemed like she had achieved something remarkable. Here she was, a young black woman in a room full of powerful executives, commanding their attention and respect with nothing but the strength of her ideas and the depth of her knowledge. It was the kind of moment that could change everything, not just for her career, but for what was possible in an industry that had traditionally been dominated by people who looked nothing like her. But then, Mueller stood up. The room immediately fell silent. Everyone knew that when the CEO stood during a presentation, he was either about to offer the highest praise or deliver the most devastating criticism. There was rarely anything in between. Mueller walked slowly around the conference table, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. His eyes remained fixed on Amara, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex problem. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried easily across the room. "Miss Johnson," he said, pronouncing her name with the precise diction of someone who had learned English as a second language. "Your presentation is interesting." Amara felt her stomach tighten. In the corporate world, interesting was rarely a compliment. Mueller continued his slow walk around the table, never taking his eyes off her. "You clearly have abilities. Your analysis is thorough, your
We need
projections
to
are
address
detailed,
this now.
and
I
your
understand, but consider the
enthusiasm
risks.
is
The risks are
evident."
calculated.
The
We
room remained
proceed.
silent. Everyone could sense that something was building, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the air becomes heavy and electric. However, Mueller continued, and Amara knew that everything that came before that word had been meaningless. "I have some concerns about this proposal. Not with the technical aspects, you understand. Those seem adequate." He paused again, and in that pause, something shifted. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke again, there was an edge to his voice that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "My concern," he said slowly, "is whether someone with your background truly understands what our customers want, what our industry needs, what our company represents." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dr. Richter shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Klaus Weber stopped taking notes altogether. Everyone could feel that they were witnessing something that crossed a line, but no one was quite sure what to do about it. Amara remained standing at the front of the room, her presentation still displayed on the screen behind her. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm and professional. "I'm not sure I understand your concern, Mr. Mueller," she said carefully. "Could you please clarify what you mean by my background?" It was a perfectly reasonable question, asked in a perfectly professional tone. But Everyone in the room knew that she was essentially asking him to either explain himself or back down. In the corporate world, that kind of direct challenge was rarely received well, especially when directed at someone with Mueller's level of power and ego. Mueller stopped walking and turned to face her directly. For a moment, his mask of corporate professionalism slipped, and everyone in the room could see the anger building behind his pale blue eyes. "I think you know exactly what I mean," he said, his voice getting slightly louder. "This company has been successful for 30 years because we understand our market, we understand our customers, and we understand what quality means in this industry." The implication was clear to everyone in the room, even though he hadn't said anything explicitly racist yet. He was questioning whether Amara, as a black woman, could truly understand the needs and expectations of their predominantly white, European customer base. It was the kind of subtle discrimination that happened in boardrooms around the world every day, just rarely so openly, and in front of so many witnesses. But Amara wasn't backing down. She had spent her entire career dealing with people who questioned her abilities based on her race and gender, and she had learned long ago that the only way to deal with such challenges was to meet them head-on. "Mr. Mueller," she said, her voice steady and clear, "my background includes 2 master's degrees from one of the world's most prestigious universities, 5 years of experience in artificial intelligence development, fluency in 5 languages including German, and a proven track record of increasing revenue and customer satisfaction at every company where I've worked." The room was completely silent now. Everyone could feel the tension building between these 2 people, and they all knew they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this single meeting. Furthermore, Amara continued, "The data in my presentation is based on extensive analysis of actual customer behavior patterns, market research, and industry trends. It's not based on assumptions or stereotypes about what people want. It's based on facts." Mueller's face was getting redder with each word she spoke. Mueller's face had turned an alarming shade of red as he began his tirade in German, his voice rising with each word. The other executives in the room shifted uncomfortably, some looking down at their papers, others glancing nervously at each other. They could all sense the venom in his tone, even if some of them didn't understand exactly what he was saying. "Dies arrogant Schwarzfrau denkt, ich kann hier herinkommen und jenes sagen, we were unser Geschaft führen sollen." Mueller spat, his hands gesticulating wildly. "Sie gehört nicht in unser Unternehmen, nicht in unser Land, und schon gar nicht in unser Wurstenzimmer." The translation of his words would have shocked even those who thought they knew him well. "This arrogant black woman thinks she can come in here and tell us how to run our business. She doesn't belong in our company, not in our country, and certainly not in our boardroom." But Mueller wasn't finished. His 30 years of suppressed prejudice came pouring out like poison from a burst dam. "Was Glot sie den, sie ist? Ein primitive Finn, diver suckt, sich in ein zivilisiert Gesellschaft einzufügen. Or Sultan sie zurückschicken, wo sie gekommen ist, beaver sie unsere Reputation ruiniert." The words were even more horrific. Who does she think she is? A primitive ape trying to fit into civilized society. "We should send her back where she came from before she ruins our reputation." Dr. Richter gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Klaus Weber had gone completely pale, staring at his CEO as if he had never seen him before. Maria Santos was frantically looking around the room, trying to gauge everyone's reactions and figure out how to minimize the damage from what was clearly going to be a catastrophic situation. Some of the other executives who didn't speak fluent German could tell from the tone and body language that something terrible was happening, but they weren't sure exactly what. Those who did understand German were sitting in stunned silence, unable to believe that their CEO had just said such things out loud, in front of witnesses, in what was supposed to be a professional business meeting. But Mueller still wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and decades of racist thinking came pouring out in a stream of consciousness that revealed the true depth of his prejudice. "Sie sollt dankbar sein, das wir überhaupt die Chance gegeben haben, hier zu arbeiten. Aberneen, stattdessen kommt sie mit amerikanischen Arroganz und denkt, ich kann uns Deutschen beibringen, wie man Gesellschaft macht. Das ist lächerlich." Ihr Art Gehort nicht hirer. She should be grateful that we even gave her the chance to work here. But, no. Instead, she comes with her American arrogance and thinks she could teach us Germans how to do business. It's ridiculous. Her kind doesn't belong here. The room had become completely silent except for Mueller's voice and the sound of his expensive shoes as he continued pacing around the conference table like a caged animal. His usually perfect appearance was becoming disheveled, his silver hair falling across his forehead, his tie slightly askew from his animated gestures. What made the situation even more surreal was the backdrop of Amara's presentation still displayed on the screen behind her. Charts and graphs showing potential revenue increases and customer satisfaction improvements provided a stark contrast to the hatred being spewed just a few feet away. Here was concrete evidence of her brilliance and potential value to the company, while their CEO revealed himself to be nothing more than a well-dressed bigot. Amara remained standing throughout Mueller's tirade, her posture straight and her face carefully neutral. But, inside, she was processing every word, every inflection, every gesture. Her mind was working like a computer, analyzing not just what he was saying, but how he was saying it, who was hearing it, and what it revealed about the man and the company she had thought she wanted to be part of. She had faced racism before, subtle and not so subtle, individual and institutional. She had been the only black student in many of her classes at MIT. She had been passed over for promotions at her previous job despite having better qualifications than the white men who were chosen instead. She had endured countless microaggressions, from colleagues touching her hair without permission to clients expressing surprise that she was so articulate. But this was different. This was raw, undisguised hatred being expressed by someone in a position of enormous power, someone who controlled the livelihoods of hundreds of employees, someone whose decisions could impact thousands of customers and millions of euros in revenue. This wasn't just personal prejudice. This was institutional racism embodied in a single person who had the authority to make it company policy. As Mueller continued his rant, Amara found herself thinking about her grandmother, who had cleaned houses for wealthy white families in Alabama during the 1960s. Her grandmother had told her stories about employers who would speak about her as if she wasn't in the room, using language that was just as vile as what she was hearing now. But her grandmother had never had the education, the position, or the platform to fight back. She had been forced to simply endure the humiliation in silence because her family needed the money. Amara thought about her parents, who had worked multiple jobs to put her through school, who had taught her that excellence was not optional, that she would have to be twice as good to get half as much. They had prepared her for moments like this, though they probably never imagined she would face them in such a public and dramatic way. She thought about Dr. Richter, who had taken a chance on her, who had fought the board to create her position, who was now watching her career investment crumble in real time. She thought about all the young girls who looked like her, who dreamed of careers in technology, who needed to see that it was possible to stand up to power and win. But, mostly, she thought about the choice that was in front of her. She could remain silent, let Mueller finish his rant, and then quietly leave the room. She could file a complaint with Human Resources later, hire a lawyer, and fight the discrimination through official channels. That would be the safe choice, the expected choice, the choice that wouldn't make waves or create enemies. Or she could do something else entirely. Mueller's voice was getting even louder and more agitated. Und das Schlimmste, das Sie denkt, Sie sei schlau. Sie persenier uns dies Natürlichen Ideen, als ob wir zu dumm wären, selbst daran zu denken. Wir haben dieses Unternehmen aufgebaut, lang beaver Sie überhaupt gebern word. And the worst part is that she thinks she's smart. She presents these ridiculous ideas to us as if we were too stupid to think of them ourselves. We built this company long before she was even born. It was at this moment that Amara made her decision. She had spent her entire life being underestimated because of her race and gender. She had worked harder than everyone around her, achieved more than most people thought possible, and conducted herself with professionalism and dignity even in the face of discrimination and disrespect. But she was done being silent. She was done allowing racist bullies to hide behind language barriers and corporate hierarchies. She was done pretending that such behavior was acceptable as long as it was expressed politely or indirectly. And she was especially done with the idea that she should be grateful for opportunities that she had earned through her own merit and hard work. Mueller was still ranting when Amara took a step forward and cleared her throat loudly enough to get his attention. The sound cut through his tirade like a knife, and he turned to look at her with an expression of surprise and annoyance. The silence that followed Amara's interruption was deafening. Mueller stood frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, as the full realization of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave. The confidence and authority he had commanded just moments before evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked suddenly older, smaller, and infinitely more vulnerable. But Amara was just getting started. She walked slowly to the center of the room, positioning herself so that she could make eye contact with every person around the conference table. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, like a master chess player who had just realized that her opponent had walked directly into checkmate. When she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and carried the kind of quiet authority that can only come from someone who knows they hold all the cards. Herr Müller, she began in German. Ich habe Jed's Wort verstanden, das Sie gesagt haben. Jede Beleidigung. Jede rassistische Bemerkung. Jeden Ausdruck von Hass und Unwissenheit. Mr. Müller, I understood every word you said. Every insult. Every racist remark. Every expression of hate and ignorance. The translation hit the room like a physical blow. Those who hadn't understood German now realized the full scope of what had just happened. Dr. Richter closed her eyes and shook her head slowly, while Klaus Weber looked like he might be physically ill. But Amara continued, switching seamlessly between German and English to ensure that everyone in the room understood exactly what was happening. You called me arrogant for presenting ideas that could increase this company's revenue by millions of euros. You said I don't belong in this company, this country, or this boardroom. You used language about me that I won't repeat because it would diminish the dignity of every person in this room. She paused and looked directly at Mueller, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. But what's most interesting, Mr. Mueller, is what your words reveal about you. Because while you were expressing your hatred in German, thinking I couldn't understand, you revealed something that I don't think you intended to share with your colleagues. The room was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed unnaturally loud. Everyone was hanging on her every word, trying to understand what she meant. You revealed that you're terrified. Terrified that someone like me could walk into your boardroom and present ideas that are better than anything your all-white, all-male leadership team has produced in decades. Terrified that your customers might actually prefer innovation over the comfortable mediocrity you've been selling them. Terrified that the world is changing, and you don't have the vision or the courage to change with it. Mueller tried to interrupt, raising his hand and opening his mouth, but Amara held up her own hand in a gesture that was so commanding, so filled with quiet authority, that he actually stopped speaking before he had said a single word. I'm not finished, she said, and the steel in her voice made it clear that she would not be interrupted again. You said I should be grateful for the opportunity to work here. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Mueller. Millennium Tech recruited me. Dr. Richter flew to Boston personally to convince me to leave a position where I was valued and respected. You offered me this job because you needed what I could provide, not the other way around. She gestured toward the presentation screen, where her data and projections were still displayed. You need my ideas because your company's growth has been stagnant for the past 3 years. You need my expertise because the artificial intelligence solutions your competitors are developing are making your products obsolete. You need my perspective because your customer base is evolving, and you're too set in your ways to evolve with them. Dr. Richter was nodding slightly, recognizing the truth in what Amara was saying. Klaus Weber was frantically scribbling notes, probably already calculating the legal and financial implications of what was happening. But here's what you really need to understand, Mr. Mueller. I don't need this job. I don't need your approval. And I certainly don't need to tolerate your racism. Amara pulled out her phone and held it up so everyone could see it. What you may not know is that I have been recording every meeting I've attended since I started working here. Not because I expected something like this to happen, but because I've learned to protect myself in environments where my contributions might be questioned or minimized. The color completely drained from Mueller's face. Several other executives looked around nervously, suddenly, wondering what else might have been captured in those recordings. So everything you just said, every racist word, every expression of hatred, every revelation of your true character, is documented permanently. She put the phone back in her pocket and smiled for the first time since Mueller had begun his tirade. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won a game that her opponent didn't even know he was playing. Now, let me tell you what's going to happen next. I'm going to walk out of this room, and I'm going to submit my resignation to Dr. Richter effective immediately. Not because I'm running away from your racism, but because I refuse to work for a company led by someone with such fundamental character flaws. She began gathering her materials from the presentation table, her movements calm and unhurried despite the chaos she was creating. But before I go, I want to share some information that might be relevant to your decision-making process, Mr. Mueller. You see, while I was developing my presentation on AI integration, I also conducted some research on your competitors. Specifically, I looked into what they might be willing to pay for the kind of expertise and innovation I bring to the table. She pulled a folder from her briefcase and placed it on the conference table. In this folder, you'll find signed offer letters from 3 of your biggest competitors. Each one is offering me significantly more money than I'm making here, along with equity stakes and leadership positions. But more importantly, each one of these companies is actively recruiting diverse talent because they understand something that you apparently don't. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. They understand that the future belongs to companies that can think differently, innovate constantly, and serve customers who don't all look like their leadership teams. They understand that diversity isn't just morally right, it's economically essential. Mueller finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You can't, this isn't, there are procedures. Amara looked at him with something that might have been pity. Mr. Mueller, you seem to be confused about the situation. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a discussion. This is me informing you that your racism has consequences. She turned to address the rest of the room. To everyone else here, I want you to know that this has nothing to do with you. Many of you have been supportive colleagues, and I've enjoyed working with you. But I cannot and will not continue to work for a company where the person at the top views people like me as less than human. The aftermath of Amara's departure from the boardroom was immediate and devastating. For several minutes after she left, nobody moved. The executives sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed and trying to understand the full implications of what had happened. Dr. Richter was the first to recover from the shock. She stood up slowly, her face pale but her voice steady when she finally spoke. This meeting is adjourned, she announced, her German accent making the words sound even more final than they already were. Everyone please return to your offices. We'll be scheduling individual meetings to discuss what happened here today. As the executives filed out of the room, their hushed conversations created a buzzing undercurrent of anxiety and speculation. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something that would have massive consequences, but no one was quite sure what those consequences would be or how they might be affected. Mueller remained in his chair, staring at the presentation screen where Amara's AI integration proposal was still displayed. The irony was not lost on anyone who remained in the room. Here was a presentation that could have revolutionized their business, created millions in new revenue, and positioned them as industry leaders, but it had been overshadowed by his own character flaws. Klaus Weber approached Mueller cautiously, as one might approach a dangerous animal that had been cornered. Friedrich, he said quietly, using Mueller's first name in a way that suggested the gravity of the situation. We need to discuss damage control. If this gets out. But Mueller wasn't listening. He was still staring at the screen, apparently lost in his own thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. She recorded everything. He whispered, more to himself than to Klaus. Everything I said, it's all documented. The full weight of his situation was beginning to sink in. In the span of 30 minutes, he had gone from being the powerful CEO of a billion-euro company to being a man whose career hung in the balance of a recording that could destroy everything he had built. Meanwhile, Amara was already 3 floors down, clearing out her office with the efficiency of someone who had always known this day might come. She packed her personal items methodically, taking time to retrieve the family photos from her desk and the small potted plant that Dr. Richter had given her as a welcome gift. Her phone was already buzzing with text messages and calls. Word traveled fast in the technology industry, and several people who had heard rumors about what happened were trying to reach her. But she wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. She needed time to process what had just happened and plan her next moves. As she packed, she couldn't help but think about the presentation she had just given or tried to give. Months of research, analysis, and preparation reduced to a backdrop for racism. She had identified opportunities that could have transformed the entire company, created jobs, improved customer satisfaction, and generated enormous profits. But none of that mattered now because their leader was more interested in expressing his prejudice than building his business. Dr. Richter appeared in her office doorway just as Amara was placing the last of her belongings in a cardboard box. "Amara," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I am so sorry. I had no idea. I never would have put you in that situation if I had known." Amara looked up from her packing and offered a sad smile. "Dr. Richter, this isn't your fault. You gave me an opportunity, and I'm grateful for that. You couldn't have known what kind of person Mueller really was." "But I should have known," Dr. Richter insisted. "I should have seen the signs. I should have protected you better." Amara finished packing and picked up her box. "Elena," she said, using Dr. Richter's first name for the first time, "you gave me exactly what I needed, a platform to show my capabilities and a chance to make a difference. What happened today wasn't a failure on your part. It was a revelation about the kind of leadership this company has, and that's information that everyone needed to have." As Amara walked toward the elevator, Dr. Richter called after her. "What will you do now?" Amara paused at the elevator doors and turned back. "I'm going to do what I always do when someone tries to limit my potential because of their own prejudices. I'm going to succeed so spectacularly that they'll spend the rest of their careers wishing they had treated me with the respect I deserved." The elevator doors closed, and Amara descended to the parking garage for the last time as an employee of Millennium Tech Industries. But her story was far from over. In fact, the most dramatic developments were just beginning. Within hours of her departure, news of the incident began to spread through the company's informal networks. Employees shared hushed conversations in break rooms and sent carefully worded text messages to trusted colleagues. The story grew with each retelling, though the basic facts remained consistent. Their CEO had launched a racist tirade against one of their most talented employees, and she had responded by exposing his character flaws in front of the entire executive team. By the end of the day, several employees had reached out to journalists they knew, speaking anonymously about the toxic culture at the top of their company. Technology reporters, always hungry for stories about discrimination in the industry, began making phone calls and asking questions. Dr. Richter spent the afternoon in emergency meetings with the board of directors, trying to explain what had happened and assess the potential damage to the company. The board members were horrified by what they heard, not just because of the moral implications, but because of the massive legal and financial risks Mueller had just created. The company's legal team was already working overtime, trying to understand their exposure and develop strategies for managing the crisis. The Human Resources Department was fielding calls from employees asking about the company's policies on discrimination and reporting procedures. The public relations team was preparing for what they knew would be an inevitable media storm. But the most significant developments were happening outside the company's walls. Amara had gone home to her apartment, where she spent several hours reviewing the recordings she had made and consulting with an employment attorney who specialized in discrimination cases. The lawyer's advice was clear. She had documented evidence of blatant workplace discrimination by the highest-ranking official in the company, creating one of the strongest cases he had ever seen. She also began reaching out to her network of contacts in the tech. The morning that would change everything began like any other in the technology industry. Executives around the world were checking their phones over coffee, scanning news feeds, and industry publications for the latest developments that might affect their businesses. But at exactly 6 a.m. Central European Time, everything changed. The headline appeared simultaneously on 3 major technology news websites. Recorded, CEO's racist rant against black employee exposes toxic culture at billion-dollar tech company. Within minutes, the story was being shared across social media platforms, forwarded through industry email lists, and discussed in break rooms and boardrooms around the world. The audio recording that Amara had made was embedded in each article, allowing readers to hear Mueller's words in their original German, followed by professional translations that made his hatred unmistakably clear. The reaction was immediate and devastating. At Millennium Tech's headquarters in Berlin, employees arriving for work found themselves surrounded by reporters and camera crews. The company's stock price plummeted by 30% in the first hour of trading, wiping out nearly €1 billion in market value. Major clients began calling to express concerns about continuing their business relationships with the company. The recording went viral in a way that executives' worst nightmares are made of. #Millennium Tech Scandal became a trending topic on social media platforms, with millions of people sharing their own experiences with workplace discrimination and calling for accountability. The audio clip was translated into dozens of languages, making Mueller's racism a global phenomenon. But the most significant reactions came from within the industry itself. By noon, 3 of Millennium Tech's largest clients had announced they were suspending their contracts pending a review of the company's leadership and values. 2 major technology conferences had revoked Mueller's speaking engagements and removed Millennium Tech as a sponsor. Several prominent investors had issued statements expressing concern about their holdings in the company. Dr. Richter spent the morning in emergency meetings with the board of directors, who were under enormous pressure from shareholders to take immediate action. The legal implications alone were staggering, not just from potential lawsuits related to Amara's case, but from the regulatory investigations that were likely to follow in multiple countries. "We have to act," insisted board member Heinrich Schultz, a veteran technology executive who had helped found several successful companies. "Every minute we delay makes this worse for everyone involved." The board's decision was unanimous and swift. By 2 p.m., Mueller had been terminated as CEO and removed from all leadership positions within the company. A press release announced that Dr. Richter would serve as interim CEO while the company conducted a comprehensive review of its policies and culture. But even Mueller's removal couldn't stem the tide of consequences that his actions had unleashed. Meanwhile, Amara was experiencing a very different kind of chaos. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke, with calls from reporters, lawyers, activists, and executives from technology companies around the world. The offers of employment that she had mentioned in the boardroom had multiplied dramatically, with companies eager to demonstrate their commitment to diversity by hiring the woman who had stood up to racism so powerfully. But the most meaningful call came from an unexpected source. "Ms. Johnson," said the voice on the other end of the line. "This is Sarah Chun, CEO of Quantum Dynamics. I've been following your story, and I have a proposition for you." Quantum Dynamics was one of the most innovative technology companies in the world, known for developing cutting-edge artificial intelligence solutions and for having one of the most diverse leadership teams in the industry. Sarah Chun had built the company from a small startup to a multi-billion-dollar corporation in just 8 years, and she was widely regarded as one of the most visionary leaders in technology. "I'm not calling to offer you a job," Chun continued. "I'm calling to offer you the opportunity to build your own company, with Quantum Dynamics as your primary investor and strategic partner." The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Chun wanted to invest $50 million in a new company that Amara would found and lead, focused specifically on developing the kind of AI integration solutions that she had proposed to Millennium Tech. But more than that, the new company would be designed from the ground up to be a model for how technology companies could embrace diversity, innovation, and ethical leadership. "Your presentation wasn't just brilliant," Chun explained. "It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach that this industry needs. But, more importantly, what you did in that boardroom showed the kind of leadership character that's been missing from too many companies for too long." As Amara considered the offer, she realized that what had started as the worst day of her career was transforming into the greatest opportunity she had ever been presented with. She would have the chance not just to implement her ideas, but to create a company culture where what happened to her could never happen to anyone else. The ripple effects of her confrontation with Mueller continued to spread throughout the industry. Within a week, 6 other technology executives had been forced to resign or been terminated following investigations into their own histories of discriminatory behavior. The hashtag tech accountability had joined hashtag Millennium Tech Scandal as a rallying cry for change within the industry. Major technology companies began announcing new diversity initiatives, not just in hiring but in leadership development and company culture. Universities started incorporating discussions about workplace discrimination and ethical leadership into their computer science curricula. Industry organizations implemented new codes of conduct and reporting procedures for harassment and discrimination. But perhaps most significantly, a new generation of diverse entrepreneurs began receiving funding and support that had been historically difficult to obtain. Investors, chastened by the public relations nightmare that discriminatory leadership could create, began actively seeking out companies led by women, people of color, and other underrepresented groups. Mueller, meanwhile, had virtually disappeared from public view. His personal reputation was in ruins, his professional network had abandoned him, and the legal challenges he faced were mounting daily. Several former employees had come forward with their own stories of discriminatory treatment, creating a pattern of behavior that made his legal situation increasingly precarious. The company he had built over 30 years was struggling to survive. Despite Dr. Richter's capable leadership and the board's efforts to implement reforms, the damage to their reputation and client relationships was proving difficult to repair. Several key employees had left for competitors, taking valuable knowledge and relationships with them. But the most poetic form of justice came 6 months later, when Amara's new company, Genesis AI, announced that it had developed breakthrough artificial intelligence technology that made Millennium Tech's products obsolete virtually overnight. The innovation that Mueller had rejected out of racism had become the foundation for a company that was now competing directly with his former business and winning. Genesis AI's first major client was one of Millennium Tech's former customers, who publicly announced that they were switching providers because they wanted to work with a company that aligned with their values. Within a year, Genesis AI had captured 15% of Millennium Tech's market share and was growing rapidly. The transformation was remarkable not just in business terms, but in cultural terms as well. Genesis AI became known throughout the industry for its innovative solutions, its diverse workforce, and its ethical leadership practices. Amara had created exactly the kind of company she had always wanted to work for, and it was succeeding beyond everyone's expectations. At the company's first anniversary celebration, Amara stood before an audience of employees, investors, clients, and industry leaders to reflect on the journey that had brought them there. A year ago, she said, I walked into a boardroom with ideas about how to improve customer experience through artificial intelligence. I left that room having learned something much more important, that the most advanced technology in the world is worthless if it's developed and implemented by people who can't see past their own prejudices. She paused, looking out at the diverse faces in the audience, employees from 6 continents, representing dozens of countries and cultures, united by their shared commitment to innovation and inclusion. What we've built here isn't just a successful business. It's proof that diversity isn't just morally right, it's economically essential. It's evidence that the future belongs to companies that can think differently, innovate constantly, and serve customers who represent the full spectrum of human experience. The applause was thunderous, but Amara wasn't finished. To anyone who thinks that standing up to discrimination is too risky, too costly, or too difficult, I want you to know that the opposite is true. The real risk isn't staying silent. The real cost isn't accepting the status quo. And the real difficulty is in trying to succeed while surrounded by people who see your diversity as a weakness rather than a strength. As she concluded her remarks, Amara thought back to that moment in the Millennium Tech boardroom when she had made the decision to speak up rather than stay silent. It had been the most important decision of her professional life, not just because of what it had cost Mueller, but because of what it had made possible for her and for countless others who would benefit from the changes her courage had set in motion. The story that began with hatred and Discrimination had become a story about justice, opportunity, and the transformative power of refusing to accept that prejudice should ever be the price of progress. And in conference rooms and classrooms around the world, a new generation of leaders was learning that sometimes the most quiet voice in the room can become the loudest call for change, if that voice belongs to someone with the courage to use it. Knowledge industry. The offers she had mentioned during her confrontation with Mueller were real, and the companies that had made them were very interested in hearing about what had happened at Millennium Tech. But, perhaps most importantly, she made a decision about how to handle the recording that would change everything. Rather than simply turning it over to lawyers or keeping it as private evidence, she decided to release it publicly, not out of vindictiveness, but because she realized that what had happened to her was symptomatic of a larger problem in the industry. Too many companies were led by people who paid lip service to diversity while harboring the same prejudices that Mueller had expressed so openly. She spent the evening working with a journalist from a major technology publication, providing context for the recording and explaining why she believed the public needed to hear what had happened. The journalist, recognizing the significance of the story, worked through the night to prepare an article that would be published the following morning. As news of the impending article began to circulate among industry insiders, the pressure on Millennium Tech's leadership intensified dramatically. Board members received urgent calls from major investors demanding explanations. The company's stock price, which had been stable for months, began to fluctuate wildly in after-hours trading as rumors spread. Mueller, meanwhile, had isolated himself in his office, refusing to take calls or meetings. He seemed paralyzed by the realization that his moment of uncontrolled anger had potentially destroyed everything he had spent his career building. But the full scope of the consequences he would face was still unknown. The recording that Amara possessed was about to become public knowledge, and when it did, it would trigger a series of events that would reshape not just his company, but the entire industry's understanding of accountability, leadership, and the true cost of discrimination. The story that had begun with a racist outburst in a boardroom was about to become a catalyst for change that would reach far beyond the walls of any single company. And at the center of it all was a young woman who had refused to let hatred triumph over justice, setting in motion forces that would ensure that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else in quite the same way again. Hand gently. Dr. Richter, I know you took a risk hiring me, and I'm sorry that it's ending this way. But I hope you understand that some compromises are too costly to make. She picked up her briefcase and walked toward the door, but she wasn't quite finished. At the threshold, she turned back to face Mueller one final time. Oh, and Mr. Mueller? You asked who I think I am. Let me tell you exactly who I am. I'm the person who just demonstrated that your 30 years of experience building this company can be undone in 30 minutes by someone with better ideas, stronger character, and the courage to stand up to bullies. She paused for effect, letting that sink in. I'm also the person who's going to use everything I learned while working here to help your competitors destroy your market share. Because unlike you, they understand that the future of technology belongs to people who can innovate, not people who can only hate. And, with that, Amara Johnson walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a room full of stunned executives and one CEO whose entire world had just collapsed around him. But the story was far from over. In fact, the most dramatic chapters were yet to come, because what Mueller didn't realize was that Amara's departure was just the beginning of the consequences he would face. The recording she had mentioned would soon find its way to people who could ensure that justice was served, and the entire industry would learn what happens when prejudice collides with progress. The quiet confidence with which she had dismantled his authority in that room was about to be amplified on a scale that would reshape not just Millennium Tech, but the entire technology sector's approach to diversity, and the true meaning of innovation. Entschuldigung, Herr Mueller, she said in perfect German, her pronunciation so flawless that several people in the room sat up straighter in shock. Excuse me, Mr. Mueller. The color drained from Mueller's face as he realized what had just happened. He had been so caught up in his racist rant that he had forgotten she had mentioned her fluency in German during her presentation. Now he was standing in front of a room full of witnesses, having just revealed his true character to someone who understood every single word he had said. But Amara wasn't finished. She had something to say, and she was going to make sure everyone in that room heard it clearly, in both German and English, so there would be no confusion about what had just happened or what was about to happen next. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Friedrich Mueller was about to learn that underestimating Amara Johnson was the biggest mistake of his professional life. He ain't used to being challenged, and he certainly wasn't used to being challenged by someone he clearly considered beneath him. In his mind, he was the CEO, the founder, the man who had built this company from nothing. Who was this young woman to question his judgment or his concerns? But what happened next would change everything. Instead of backing down or apologizing for the implied accusation of racism, Mueller did something that revealed his true character to everyone in the room. He abandoned any pretense of corporate professionalism and showed everyone exactly who he really was. He began speaking in rapid German, apparently forgetting that Amara had mentioned her fluency in the language just moments before. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and his words were chosen specifically to be as hurtful and degrading as possible. But he had made one critical mistake. He had assumed that because Amara was black and American, she wouldn't understand what he was saying. He thought he could unleash his racism in his native language while maintaining plausible deniability if anyone questioned him later. What he didn't realize was that his moment of uncontrolled anger was about to become his biggest mistake. Because Amara Johnson wasn't just fluent in German, she was fluent enough to understand every single word he was saying. And, more importantly, she was smart enough and strong enough to use his own hatred against him in a way that would leave everyone in the room speechless. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only define both of their careers, but would also become a turning point in the entire industry's approach to diversity, respect, and the true meaning of leadership.